King George, it should be said, not a famous intellectual, showed no such ambivalence. He continued in a long European tradition of royal toleration of the nobility's propensity for flouting laws that were supposed to reflect the sovereign's will. Wellington got to Windsor by midday to report at court on what he'd done. Greville tells us that the king was highly pleased with the Winchelsea affair. According to the editor of the Literary Gazette, His Majesty supposed that given Wellington's sensitivity, being a soldier, the course pursued had been unavoidable. Military gentlemen, the king knew, occupied a defining place in the world of honour. And perhaps for this reason, the opinion of many ordinary men and women seems to have swung behind Wellington. As the Duchess told her son, the Duchess of Wellington, told her son, whereas before the mob were abusing your father, now they are cheering him again. The Duke himself judged that the affair had turned out well. Quote, the atmosphere of calumny in which I had been for some time living cleared away. So I asked a while ago what Wellington thought he was doing. We could both sharpen and soften the question. On the softening side, it could be argued that while, as I say, duelling was illegal, it was in fact quite frequent among those who held the highest political offices. Of the 10 prime ministers who preceded Wellington, 3, Lord Shelburne, Pitt and Canning, fought duels, as did Charles Fox and the Earl of Bath, each of whom was almost prime minister in that period. And Peel, who was to follow the Duke eventually to the premiership, had shown himself willing to accept challenges as well. Of those who served as foreign secretaries in the same period, Castlereagh, Canning and Fox all took to the field in duels, the former two against each other. There was, in fact, widespread agreement among legal authorities in England, Scotland and Ireland that it was almost unheard of in the century before Wellington and Winchelsea faced each other on Battersea Fields for a gentleman who observed the rules of honour to be prosecuted successfully for murder if he killed his opponent. V.G. Kiernan tells us of a lawyer affirming in 1771, quote, that he knew of no instance in England of capital punishment following a duel properly conducted. The law, of course, has no notion of the proper conduct of the duel, so there has to be some other standard than a legal standard by which you decide that it's properly conducted. The standard pattern, if one party was killed, was for the survivor to disappear abroad and to wait and see if a prosecution was brought. This was because of the conditions in English prisons at the time, so you weren't accused of cowardice for avoiding those conditions, which are appalling. If you were not charged, you could return home and go back to business. If you were prosecuted, then honour required you to come back, and you had behaved properly, you would present the fact to a jury of your peers. The judge was quite likely to be sympathetic, and the jury was quite likely to acquit you anyway, even if the judge wasn't sympathetic. In the unlikely event that you were convicted and sentenced to death, connections in court made it likely that you would anyway be pardoned. So duelling was one way of literally getting away with murder, what was legally murder. This wasn't because the authorities were squeamish about executions. In a typical year in the 18th century, there were some 100 executions in England and Wales. In the mid-century, there were more than 30 a year at Tyburn, London's place of public execution alone. An execution for gentlemen, even members of the House of Lords, was not just a legal possibility. In 1760, the Earl Ferrers was executed for murder at Tyburn. He was tried by the House of Lords, of course. No, the reason duelists were not condemned was simply that the official legal norm didn't reflect the social consensus, which ran the other way. Indeed, since Wellington's youth, there'd almost certainly been an increase in the frequency of duelling, in part because the turn of the 19th century was an extended period of warfare, the Napoleonic Wars. Some 500,000 Britons had served in the Anglo-French warfare between the execution of Louis XVI in 1793 and the Battle of Waterloo. Their officers brought back from Europe the military's culture of honour. So, admitting all this, but now sharpening the question, Greville's stern judgment that Wellington's behaviour was juvenile might seem to be moderately understated. Shouldn't we ask not what, but what on earth Wellington thought he was doing? After all, had he been killed, the country and the king would have lost the Prime Minister in the midst of a constitutional crisis in a legal affair that was about the issues at stake in that crisis. It was a crisis about Catholicism, and the dispute between Wellington and Winchelsea was about Catholicism and the English Church. Few things could have been more destabilising in an already unsettled realm, a realm which in the case of Ireland, as the Wellington had said, was on the verge of civil war. Had he killed Winchelsea, on the other hand, the Duke would have had to be tried before the House of Lords for murder, as Lord Cardigan was tried in 1841 for wounding a Captain Tuckett in a duel, and you'll be glad to know that the House of Lords acquitted their member. At a minimum, Wellington would have had to resign from the cabinet, just as though two other Anglo-Irish politicians, George Canning and Viscount Castlereagh, had to resign as Foreign Secretary and Secretary of War, respectively, after their own duel 2 decades earlier. And had there been a trial, the Lords would have been faced with a difficult choice. This was a decade after Peterloo, when members of the military class that Wellington represented had cut down ordinary men and women in the streets of Manchester, killing a dozen men and 3 women, half a dozen of them sabred before they were trampled to death. Many in Parliament and country were agitating for reform, and they were being resisted by a highly unrepresentative Parliament dominated by an unelected aristocracy. It was not a good moment for the authorities to look mildly on a serious breach of the peace by a peer while they were dealing with the lower orders with such violent resolve. And had his peers declined to excuse him, which was, I think, unlikely, they would have imposed that unpopular task on the king, since actually executing Wellington was obviously out of the question. So it's worth reflecting on the arguments in this context where this man who has all these reasons not to duel does duel. It's worth reflecting on the arguments that both the law and conventional Christian morality had made against the duel. One source of the modern European duel, whose contours take shape, as I said, in 16th century Italy, was a form of judicial combat in which members of the military ruling class, gentlemen of the rank of squire and above, that was the definition of people who could enter into this, could settle legal disputes by a passage of arms, provided a sufficiently important feudal lord, the Duke of Burgundy, say, or one of the kings of princes of Europe, granted them, as the expression was, the field, granted them the field. But then the lord would have to sit there and watch the duel and adjudicate. The presupposition of this practice was that God would grant victory to the knight whose cause was just. It was this form of combat that the Church had first opposed as early as the 9th century. One objection was a matter of biblical morality. In Luke chapter 4, verses 9 to 12, you'll recall, Satan places Christ on a pinnacle of the temple in Jerusalem and says to him, "If thou be the Son of God, cast thyself down from hence. For it is written, he shall give his angels charge over thee to keep thee." And Jesus, answering him unto him, said, "It is said, thou shalt not tempt the Lord thy God." Well, in judicial combat, the Lord and those he granted the field were all, in a similar manner, tempting God. They were asking God to intervene in order to make sure that the right person won. Send his angels to put it right. The more obvious objection, however, was that a duel involves a violation of the 6th, or if you are a Catholic or Lutheran, the 5th commandment. Thou shalt do no murder. In a duel over a point of honor, you are trying to kill a man who has offended you, or a man who has taken offense. Neither is, from a Christian point of view, sufficient reason to take someone's life. These objections to judicial combat extended to the modern duel. The rational problem was at bottom that a duel was about an offence by A against B's honour, but granted God's non-interference, its outcome depended in no way on whether A or B was in the wrong. A duel could establish that you were brave or foolhardy enough to fight, and so it could serve to refute one particular kind of insult to a gentleman, namely an accusation of cowardice. But even then, neither actually killing your opponent, nor even more obviously being killed, actually established that you were brave. Murdering another human being, an offence against the moral law, and risking being murdered yourself, an offence against rational self-interest, both risks were inevitable byproducts of this process. And the question was whether the ostensible aim of the duel, the protection of honour, was worth that price.